Good morning and welcome to the latest episode of Full Throttle here on Unprecedented TV. This is where we slam the pedal to the metal on the issues preoccupying Britain, whether it's tax grabs strangling drivers, the fiscal black hole bankrupting the nation, unchecked immigration clogging our roads and communities, or the totalitarian grip silencing free speech and common sense.
And I'm Paul Naylor, Communications Director for the Alliance of British Drivers, and today we're roaring into Britain's political dumpster fire, from crumbling parties and vested interests to democratising a great people trapped in a small space.
On this episode, we're thrilled to be joined by the indomitable Christopher Monckton, who is the Viscount of Brenchley, the peerless provocateur who's dismantling the establishment one myth at a time, and particularly in relation to the runaway, man-made, carbon dioxide-driven climate change myth.
And after you've watched this episode, tune in again for part 2, where Christopher will further elaborate on his views. Views that aren't necessarily those of the Alliance of British Drivers and its individual parties, but views nonetheless. So buckle up, this is Full Throttle.
Welcome, Christopher Monckton. Thanks very much for coming on the programme. We're very honoured and very pleased that you've taken up the opportunity to talk to us.
Well, it's grand to be with you. I may cough and splutter a little because I've just picked up what I think may be COVID, but you won't catch it down the line, so you should be all right.
Well, I hope you're isolating.
But anyway, lots of congratulations to the Association of British Drivers for standing up against what one might call the blob, the establishment, what the French contemptuously but justifiably call the classe politique. And these creeps who sit there and they are predators, apex predators upon the taxpayer and, of course, above all, the motorist. And there are very few people these days who will now dare to speak up against the blob when it is trying to destroy not just motoring as we recognize it, where it goes vroom, vroom, rather than chirrup, chirrup, but also to set Britain free again from endless overregulation and, in particular, all the climate change nonsense, which is pretty much rubbish from start to finish. So fire away with your questions, and I will do my best to look intelligent and give you some sensible answers.
Okay. We'll take you up on that, Christopher.
That was brilliant. That was brilliant.
Okay, so let's start with the state of the political parties. You've called the Tories a chocolate teapot in the past, a Labour a sycophantic machine. I presume that Charlotte's found these quotes somewhere and read them back. So, with Reform storming the 2025 locals and 41% of the seats, is this the end for the two-party stranglehold, do you think?
I think that Reform, under the formidable Nigel Farage, whom I worked with for many years in UKIP, and are now doing things for in the Reform Party, he has single-handedly already transformed British politics once by setting us free from the tentacles of the European tyranny by Clark. And that was an extraordinary achievement, given that the whole establishment, the whole of the blob, wanted to keep us as prisoners of this anti-democratic experiment in migrating the Soviet constitution westward from Russia into Europe and then also into Britain. And he stood pretty much alone against all that and succeeded in getting us Brexit, despite the mess that both Theresa May and Boris Johnson tried to make of it. We do substantially have Brexit now, and we'll get more of it, I think, as time goes on. So he has already won his spurs. And a couple of years ago, I was in a TV studio somewhere with him, and I said, "I'm sorry, mate, you think you've retired, but you're actually going to have to save your country a second time." because the two-party system is finished. The Conservative Party has disappeared up its own tailpipe. The Labour Party has always been communist and is now laughably and visibly so. And so these two dead parties are merely occupying space without doing anything useful with it. And this is where Nigel, he sighed when I said this to him. And he said, "Oh, I thought I had done my bit." I said, "Mate, you've more than done your bit, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to do a bit more, in fact, quite a lot more." And he set up Reform with Richard Tice. The two of them got together. I went to the launch in London, and the press all turned out because by then they'd realized they were dealing with an irresistible phenomenon in the shape of Nigel Farage. And they'd also realized by then that doing what the remarkably insensitive and stupid two-tier Keir Starmer said, trying to call him a racist, which is the standard leftist accusation against anyone that is proving to be effective against them politically. And very foolishly, Starmer was saying he's a racist. He's now had to backtrack shamefully on that, as on so much else in his brief, unhappy, gloomy, miserable Presbyterian period in what I won't call power, because it certainly isn't that. I won't really call it office. I'll just call it in number 10, when frankly, he might as well not be there. He's like sort of antimatter. He's sitting there, but achieving absolutely nothing, bankrupting the country. And of course, as far as drivers are concerned, having a communist government is a nightmare, because the one thing the communists don't believe in, and I'm going to use the word communist advisedly. A few years ago, my lovely wife used to say to me, "Oh, don't use the word communist when you're talking about the left, because it makes you sound extreme." I said, "Well, here's the thing. I say it like I see it. I'm a brung up in Yorkshire, and we call a spade a bloody shovel. We do not call it a one-person operated, manually controlled, foot-powered implement of simple and robust, yet adequately efficacious ligno-metallic composition, designated primarily, though by no means exclusively, for utilization on the part of hourly paid operatives deployed in the agricultural, horticultural, or construction, or trades or industry, as the case may be, for purposes of carrying out such excavation of tasks or duties as may, from time to time, be designated by supervisory grades as being necessary, desirable, expedient, apposite, or germane with regard to the ongoing furtherance of the task or objective in hand, or on the other hand, underfoot." Prime Minister.
That's a pretty good job description written by an extreme far left individual. But I think part of the problem now is that the political spectrum, the idea that far left and far right are different is actually not true, because they're identical in effect. So far left and far right have come together and left the rest of us, the libertarians, at the other end of the political axis, I think.
You're even more right than you know. You see, originally, at the beginning of the Second World War, you're too young to remember, but at that time, Russia, which was then communist-led, as it is now, and also Germany, which was fascist-led, and thank goodness it no longer still is, they were allies. Yeah. And why were they allies? Because the full title of the Nazi Party was the Nationalsozialistische Deutschlands Arbeitspartei, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. It was a left-wing death cult, just like communism. Yeah. And so the communists, having changed sides when they saw that we were going to win, they then, after the war, under the Disinformation Directorate of the Komitet Gosudastvenной Bezopasnosti, the KGB, decided to rebrand their former Nazi allies as right-wing, when in fact they were left-wing. And so now, every time the left disagrees with someone, they call them fascist, when in fact the fascist movement was a socialist movement. Yes. And so that's what they did. They reframed the debate so that they could hurl the insult fascist or Hitler Youth, which is another one which that ghastly man Lammy, I think it was, has just come out to describe reform. This kind of talk is not how politics should be conducted. And what it shows is oh, there he is, what an ass. And he is, he is a complete waste of space. He's entirely unaware of what he's doing. The judiciary has now become thoroughly woke, which is the modern word among the young for communist. Yes. And they are no longer be trusted. You no longer get justice out of the courts, and particularly the ludicrous so-called Supreme so-called court, which was an invention of the ghastly Tony Blair. Before that, it was the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords that was the final court of appeal in this country, and they did it properly. But now we have a highly politicized, very left-wing court, so-called Supreme Court, and that is going to be sullenly determined to do down every policy that reform tries to argue for. So the so-called Supreme so-called court is going to have to be swept away, along with all of the other constitutional wreckages caused in a series of acts of parliament by Tony Blair, with the extraordinarily ineffective acquiescence of the Conservative Party during the Blair years, by which this constitutional series of reforms transferred all real power from the parliament we elect and the ministers chosen by the prime minister from the governing party that we elect into the hands of the quangos, the blobocracy. And so
the civil
democracy was really dismantled. Well, the civil service, absolutely. The uncivil, it's not a service either. It's, it's neither of the two words is correct, rather like the Holy Roman Empire. None of the words mean what they say. And so Nigel realizes this, and he has begun to realize quite recently just how difficult it's going to be, even if, as I think you and I both expect is now going to happen, he will win the next general election with an overall majority, and probably quite a handsome one, as the Tories and Labour both continue to implode, and the other left-wing parties are all in various little communist factions, like the Greens, who are probably the most communist of the lot. And so he knows now that it's going to be very, very difficult to make Britain governable again, and to make the civil service, the courts, the churches, the quangos, the unions, all the various centres of undemocratic and even anti-democratic power, once again accountable to those whom you and I shall have elected at the ballot box. This is going to be the biggest difficulty that Nigel Farage faces. And it's a formidable difficulty, and he is well aware of it, and very detailed steps are now being put into place so that as soon as he enters number 10 Downing Street, a seismic shock will go through the jelly-like blob, and it will wobble, but it will not resist the will of the people. We shall have our way. We shall once again be sovereign. And it was Francis Bacon, back in Elizabethan times, who was a great philosopher, who said in his formidable essays on politics, "Beware small men in great place." And that's what you've got now in the Conservative and Labour parties, indeed in all the other parties other than Reform now in government. But this is a nation of great men in a small place. And the electors have begun to realize that Nigel Farage doesn't speak the gobbledygook of the classe politique. He speaks plain English that they understand, that they want to hear, and that they sympathize with, and that he is on their side. This bloke down the pub image that he has has is a deserved one. And, he will go and drink his pint of beer with the working man in the pub in a way that most politicians these days would simply be childishly embarrassed by. They wouldn't know what to say to a working man. But he talks our language, and that makes him really unique in British politics today. So as you can see, I am very much hoping that he does win the next election outright. My main concern at the moment is that the communists have been deliberately imploding the British economy.
Yes.
With the aim of, when they eventually pass out of office and they dump the whole mess that they have made in the hands of reform, the economy will then collapse at weeks after the general election. Reform will be holding the baby at the time, and Nigel will get the blame and be driven out of office, whereupon back will come the communists, this time red in tooth and claw, and we'll have full-blown communism. That's what they're trying to do, but they made a miscalculation. They had not fully realized how fragile the economy is after the idiocies of Johnson and Sunak in particular, the huge unnecessary spending during COVID, which bankrupted the British state. And it's becoming impossible for the government each month to borrow enough money to keep the day-to-day cash flow of the government running. And this is a huge problem, because if you've ever run a business, you will know that it's when the cash flow goes tits up, that's when you lose everything. And the Labour Party has now, by vast overspending and by deliberately malicious policies such as Net Zero, which are designed to destroy the British economy, to destroy manufacturing industry, to drive our last significant steelworks into extinction, so that we no longer make virgin steel in any quantities anywhere in the country that founded the process for making steel and founded the Industrial Revolution. We can no longer make virgin steel, which is why a recently outgoing chief of the defense staff said very bluntly that, so weakened by successive governments, not just Labour, it's the Tories as well, they've so cut the defence establishment to ribbons that we could now fight only a very small war, and only for 1 week. After that, we'd run out of material. There would be no guns, there would be no personnel carriers, there would be no tanks, there would be no planes, because we haven't got the steel to make them with, and we can't make it anymore because we're saving the planet from global warming, which is happening at rather less than half the originally predicted and still universally predicted in climatology mid-range rate. And that means that the rate at which the world is actually warming is below the entire enormous range of guesses by communist bodies such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a purely political body which has absolutely no knowledge of science and still less of economics. And these numpties have joined just today by Pope Leo XIV, who really ought to know better, because he's basically much more grown up than the Pope, who was an out-and-out communist. But he has also now begun wittering on about global warming, and we must all stand together to introduce ever tighter regulation. But of course, he's not talking of regulating the huge communist economies of the giants of the East, Russia and China, and the communist influenced giants of the East, India and Pakistan. Oh no, India, after all, has told the G7 just a couple of years ago that they were going to increase their coal-fired generation by 60% in the next few years. Pakistan by 300%. China emits more carbon dioxide than just about the rest of the planet added together. It's now, I think, about 2/3 of total emissions. And then you've got Russia, which has virtually no wind and solar power, because the Russian Academy of Sciences, whom I briefed on this back in 2017, knows perfectly well that climate change is, to use the technical term, total cock.
It's quite interesting. It's quite interesting that the one climate model that actually resembles what the observed data looks like is by Habibullah Abdusamatov, who's a Russian astrophysicist and climatologist, and that's the only one that doesn't have carbon dioxide as a forcing influence.
But there is one other.
There's one other.
That is the official Russian Academy of Sciences climate model, which, well, I'll tell you what happened. When I was invited to go to Moscow and brief the Kremlin in the days when they weren't invading Europe, I went to a meeting sponsored by the Russian Academy of Sciences. I gave my talk, and the minder from the Russian Academy afterwards said, "Blimey, you mean the whole thing is based on a series of strikingly elementary errors of physics?" I said, "Yes, it is. It's well established. But, of course, the people profiteering out of this don't want to admit their own ignorance, because otherwise their profits from this, or their profiteering, I should say, from this nonsense would dry up." Yeah. So the minder from the Russian Academy said, "I want you to come to a meeting, a high-level scientific discussion this afternoon with all the world's leading climate scientists. And the meeting will be led by academician Semenyov, who was and is the deputy head of the Russian Academy of Sciences." So I went along, and Semenyov started out and he said, "Right." He said, "Why is it that we predict that if you double the CO2 in the air, or if you burn all the coal, oil and gas that there is over the next century, which is about the same emissions, and then it all runs out, why can't we tell whether that's going to be 2 Celsius of warming, 3 Celsius, 4 Celsius, or 5 Celsius of warming? Why is there this huge interval of uncertainty from 2 to 5 Celsius? Why, after 30 or 40 years of slaving away with our wank models," he didn't actually use that word, but you can see what he was thinking, "why can't we narrow this down?" So I thought, this will be fun. So I listened while, Professor Mojib Latif, who was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change representative, rabbited on. And then there was somebody from, the Greenpeace Communist Front, the watermelons, the green on the outside, red on the in, and all these various fatuous profiteers of doom. And I thought, I'll let them all run into silence. And then I said, "Academician Semenyov, the reason is that all these people have made, right at the heart of their climate models, an elementary error of physics, which I'm going to describe in the simplest possible terms, at a vital point in their calculations of how much global warming we may cause. They forgot that the sun was shining. It is as serious as that." And Semenyov was instantly fascinated, because the meeting came to an end shortly thereafter and everybody scuttled off. And Semenyov made a beeline, not for any of these, professors of climatology and this and that. He came straight to me. He said, "Right, come with me. I want you to explain what you've just explained to this meeting to the head of the IPCC at this meeting, which is Mojib Latif, the professor." So he came, and he said in that lofty way which communists in academia have when they're dealing with anybody who they know not to be communist, he said, "Well, I suppose we had better agree, had we not, on the equation of climate sensitivity," which in plain English is the how much warming are we going to cause equation. So in front of Semenyov, I wrote down 2 equations on a napkin and thrust them into under the nose of Mojib Latif and said, "Right, here are 2 equations. The first one is what you think is the equation of climate sensitivity. It is incorrect, because there is no term anywhere in that equation for the dominant temperature signal in the entire climate, which is what is known in climatology as the solar-driven emission temperature, which is, it all has to be done in Kelvin in climate science, and it's 255 Kelvin, and the warming by natural greenhouse gases is only 8 Kelvin, and all the warming, the direct warming by anthropogenic greenhouse gases since 1750 is only just over 1 Kelvin. And they were saying, well, that 1 Kelvin is going to cause a complete disaster and unbalance the climate, and we're all going to fry. Well, no, we're not. They simply forgot to include in what is called the feedback amplifier block diagram the input signal, which is that 255 Kelvin. And then there are 2 direct gain signals, 8 Kelvin of natural direct warming compared with the sunshine from the greenhouse gases that were already there, nothing to do with us in 1750, and then just 1 Kelvin of direct warming from us since 1750. And you put those in there, and then you have to work out another term in this feedback amplifier equation, and that is known as the net aggregate feedback intensity, because you get an amplification of the direct temperature. It's not just of the direct warming, still less of just the anthropogenic direct warming. It is of the entire direct temperature, which is 255 plus 8 plus 1, 264 Kelvin. And the net aggregate feedback intensity responds to that entire direct temperature signal. And that is what the climatologists had not understood. And my team has gone right back through 40 years of these ridiculous papers on climate sensitivity. Not a single one of them at any point mentions that the sun is shining and that the input, the proper input to the temperature feedback amplifier is 255 Kelvin, the sunshine temperature. That is how monstrous the error is. It's what is called an order of magnitude error. It's an understatement in this case by a factor of 10 of the input to the feedback circuit, and therefore an overstatement by a factor of 10 in the feedback intensity, so that they think that most of the warming that we might cause comes from this knock-on additional feedback effect and not directly from global warming. And in that, I have to tell you, they are simply incorrect. So I explained this to Mojib Latif, and he didn't want to know. I don't think he really understood what we were saying. I showed him what the corrected equations looked like. He said, what are these terms? I said, these are the standard terms in the control theoretic feedback amplifier equation. There's nothing unusual. You find it in textbooks going back to 1934, when Harold S. Black at Bell Labs in New York had designed the first ever feedback amplifier circuit. He had made sure, of course, that the input signal in that circuit was included. Of course, he was doing this in electronic circuits rather than in the climate, but the mathematics of how these feedback loops work is exactly the same. And so when he tried to apply for a patent on behalf of Bell Labs in New York, as it then was, for whom he was working, for particularly the negative feedback amplifier, which is a way of calming down an international telephone signal. So you amplify the signal, but you suppress the noise and crackle, which would otherwise prevent the signal from being sent across continents. They wouldn't give him a patent because they said, oh no, this is simply a circuit. It couldn't possibly work. It's just woo-woo, it's voodoo, it's nonsense. And he tried to get the British Patent Office to grant a patent, and they wouldn't either. So in the end, he got hold of a guy from the Patent Office in New York and took him by the scruff of his scrawny neck and took him to Bell Labs telephone exchange in New York. And he showed him 70 of these feedback amplifiers actually in operation. And he gave him a multimeter and said, look, you can touch the terminals to various points in the soldering and you can see what's going on in the circuit. And you will see that the equations that I show in my paper on this are indeed the equations that apply to such a gadget, which is why it works, which is why if you want to ring Los Angeles from here, you now can, and instead of hearing, you'll actually hear people speaking in both directions, because the feedback circuit is filtering out the static. That's what it's for in electronic circuitry. And so the mathematics of this has been known since the 1930s, but this comes as a complete abject surprise to any climatologist. They have no idea of any of this, and Mojib Latif looked completely blank and rather horrified. And so Semenyov's reaction was priceless. This is the deputy head of the Russian Academy of Sciences. We're not dealing with some half-wit here. He saw that Semenyov didn't understand a word of what I've just said to you, didn't understand the importance of the fact that the sun is shining, and that's where most of the temperature on this planet comes from. So he got rid of him, and he said, you've made your point. If the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in the person of its senior representative at this conference, cannot answer what to me is the very simple point that you are making, then I would like you now to brief Russia's chief climate modeler. And so this little gnome-like figure appeared, and he sat down in front of me, and it took me exactly 20 seconds to explain it to him. And he clapped his hand to his forehead. He's one of the brightest people I've ever met. And he went, Bоже mой. Oh my God, he said, this is terrible. And he turned to Semenyov and he said, I'm very sorry, I'm going to have to go. He said, well, I'm going to have to reprogram the model completely. We can't leave it like this. It's a monstrous error. And we've all made it, he said. Now there is an honest scientist, and also a bright enough one to understand that you do have to allow for the fact that that big yellow thing in the sky is what dominates the temperature on Earth. And therefore, at every point in your calculation of global warming, including inside this feedback amplifier circuit, you have to allow for the fact that the sun is shining. If you don't, you will get an order of magnitude error. Now, only a few weeks ago, the world's foremost climatologist, who is Professor Richard Lindzen, formerly of MIT, now living in retirement in Paris, but still very active in climate change research. And he knows more about the strange habits of the climate than anyone else alive. He's an absolutely astonishing man. And he wrote to me and he said, you may like to see this list of the various predictions of about 20 or 30 different climate models of how much warming they're going to be. Now, you can guess which of the models predicted the most warming, and those were 3 British ones. They were right at the top of the list. And they, of course, you have people from the Royal Meteorological Society and fellows of the Royal Society who, in my experience, know absolutely no science at all. They are just placemen from the bureaucracy. They're utterly, utterly useless. And indeed, the present head of the Royal Society is due to retire, but unfortunately, he's going to be replaced by somebody even worse. Adrian Smith is the present guy. He goes around saying to people, it is not legitimate to raise any questions whatsoever about the official narrative on the climate question. Now, when King Charles II of blessed memory, back in 1662, 2 years after he came back from France, and we lined the streets, you're too young to remember, but we lined the streets all the way from Dover to London. And there were only 1 million people in Britain at the time, but they were all on that cheering when the monarchy came back. I'm totalitarianism, death cult of the ghastly Cromwell and the Puritan. They were slung out and merry England came back. And one of the first things that Charles II did was to set up the Royal Society. And he said, look, it's in their charter, which is in Latin, which of course none of them reads anymore. But what it says at one vital point is that I am particularly fond of real world experiments, not wank models. I want you to do proper experiments, both to hammer out a new theory, ex tundere, is a wonderful Latin word to hammer out. You can hear tundere, you could hear the hammering going on. Or expolire veterem, which is to polish up and perfect an old theory. That's what the Royal Society was founded to do. Its present president has absolutely no interest whatsoever in honouring those obligations in the Society's charter. And nor will his successor, Paul Nurse. They both have absolute contempt for anything that questions the party line on climate or on anything else, where there is now, in the largely communized academia, a settled, though manifestly incorrect view. So that's how we know that the Russians know perfectly well that global warming isn't a problem. Now, the Chinese also got in touch, and they said, would you please write a paper in the Bulletin of the Chinese Academy of Sciences? We did that back in 2015. And that was published, and that's been downloaded more times by a factor of 12 times over than any other paper in the 75-year history of that distinguished journal. And we said there is a mistake right at the heart of their calculations. At that time, we didn't know exactly what the mistake was. But in 2017, the White House rang up. The head of communications, who at that time was Steve Bannon, rang up, and he said, we've seen your paper, your team's paper, in the the Chinese Academy of Sciences bulletin, and you hinted there that there is this central error of physics right at the heart of the calculations of how much global warming we may cause, and once you correct for that, there really isn't a problem. I said, yes, and we've now, he said, have you found out what the error is? I said, yes, we have. In fact, I said, I've just briefed the Russians on it. He said, right, I want you to send me a one-page note explaining the point. I will put it in front of President Trump. And he did. And 1 week thereafter, President Trump, having got his scientists to check what we were saying, pulled America out of the Paris Climate Accords for the first time. That's how quick Donald Trump is in getting on with stuff once he knows what the truth is. Yeah. And so that's how he eventually realized that climate change is indeed formally proven to be nonsense. Yeah. And this is a published result, but you will not see it mentioned in any of what one might call the Marx stream media, who will only parrot the party line. And you certainly won't see any mention of it in the ramblings, bless his little cotton socks, of Pope Leo XIV on this question. You know, the truth is that the job of the Pope is to look after the spiritual realm. Pronunciations on climate change by somebody who knows absolutely nothing of climate science.
Hello, I'm Basil Valentine, and this is Unprecedented TV, unfiltered, uncensored, unprecedented, the home of free speech here on the internet. Do please like and subscribe over at YouTube. Follow us on X, and remember, I'm on air every day, Monday to Friday, 1 p.m. for Ascending Order, your daily news edit with live guests and all the genuinely most important stories from around the world. Don't allow yourself to be propagandized by the corporate media. Forget the world at one on Radio 4. Join me, Basil Valentine, instead, 1 p.m. on X, Monday to Friday, also on YouTube. And I'll see you all very soon.
Climate science has never published in the field, has never had any training in physics, wouldn't know how to work an equation if he tried. It's valueless.
Yes.
And so this kind of posturing by so-called world, so-called leaders is frankly becoming more and more embarrassing, because it's not as though that was the only mistake that was made by climatologists. It was far and away the most serious, because it is very definitely a very gross, very large error. And once you correct it, the entire problem of global warming goes away. But you'll still get some global warming, but it will only be that small direct warming probably, if you really pushed it, it might come to 1 Celsius by the end of this century, after which the fossil fuels, as they call them, the coal, oil and gas, as you and I would call them, will have largely run out or become so expensive to extract that nobody will be doing it. So there's not only that central error of not understanding how control theory, the theory of feedback amplification in dynamical systems such as the climate, which change their state over time, they don't understand that. But they also don't understand, again in these wank models, they don't understand what propagation of uncertainty in quadrature across the 876,500 time steps, 1 hour long each, over a century, with which these models evolve. They start with what are called initial conditions. And then there is uncertainty in these values that you feed into the model right at the start. Because of that uncertainty, if you have lots and lots of hourly time steps and you let the climate sort of develop in the model according to these hourly time steps, then you will get a very large propagation or spreading of uncertainty. So if you start out, for instance, with the uncertainty of 4 units in the radiative forcing from the clouds, which is a very important quantity in the climate, then by the time you've gone through a century of these individual hourly calculations that the models do, the propagated uncertainty in your prediction of how much global warming we might cause by the end of a century would be plus or minus 15 Celsius degrees. And that's known as the envelope of uncertainty. Any prediction of global warming that falls inside that envelope is statistically long proven to be meaningless. It has no validity or predictive skill whatsoever. And I was actually at the World Federation of Scientists conference on planetary emergencies back in 2016, when Dr. Patrick Frank of the Stanford Linear Accelerator Laboratory gave a riveting talk on this subject. And the assembled ranks of the communist scientists were absolutely furious with him. They howled him down and they screeched at him because they couldn't understand a word of what he was saying, but they could see that if he was right, it was absolutely deadly to the Communist Party line on the climate, which they all so fervently but foolishly espoused. So they shouted him down in that brutal way that they have. And almost burst into tears. And I intervened and said, look, he's right about this. These models are worthless. They can't tell you anything whatsoever about how much global warming we may cause. They are simply guesswork. And he has formally proven that that is the case. He was rejected 13 successive times by different journals before eventually a reviewer called Professor Carl Wunsch, who's on the other side of the debate, but he's an honest man. There are still a few left, thank God. Look, the paper says, I do not like this conclusion, but it is self-evidently true. And therefore, this paper is to be published. So it was published, and the whole climatological world simply looked the other way and paid no attention.
But Christopher, the problem now is that you know that the Russians and the Chinese, and probably the Indians, because the Indians talk to the Russians and the Chinese, they know global warming has no real scientific basis. It's voodoo, as you say. Yeah. Why have we continued down this path of self-mutilation, self-industrial mutilation and the dismantling of our society? Who is driving this
right.
initiative?
Well, the original driver of it, who first made, for instance, the error of control theoretic physics that I talked about earlier, was a communist at NASA called James Hansen. And he published a paper in 1984, an appropriate year, as you may think, in which he first made this mistake. All of communist academia, because essentially if you go to Cambridge or Oxford or any great university now, it's more or less totally communist dominated. It's really terrifying. It's a monoculture of unthinking and pathetically acquiescent communism. And so they all began parroting this mistake. And that's why nobody ever corrected it until my team came along and said, hang on a moment, none of this actually adds up. It doesn't accord with well-established pre-existing theory, which has been proven time and time again in many different fields of physics. And so It was first of all a communist who did it. He didn't do it because he was a communist. He did it because he was stupid. He just didn't know enough of the mathematics and physics of how a feedback amplifier works to get it right.
That was Viscount Christopher Monckton, firing on all cylinders, I'm sure you'll agree, about the state of British politics and the rise of reform. But we've only scratched the surface in that first episode.
And in the next episode, Viscount Monckton will expand on his views, and particularly on the fallacies that are embodied in the IPCC's claims about runaway man-made carbon dioxide-driven climate change, which he comprehensively demolishes.
So subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can catch it live. And we'll see you in the next episode.